I am aware that this is the Victor Hugo Society and not the François Truffaut Society, and I promise to keep the emphasis on how Truffaut represents Hugo's youngest daughter and on the way that he also represents what one character in the film describes as the world's greatest living poet at the time, that is the genius that was Victor Hugo. I found Laura's talk absolutely fascinating from the point of view of the real Adèle Hugo. Is this possible to show the trailer? I would like just to show you a trailer, just to give you either a foretaste or possibly a reminder of the kind of mood of the film.
Je m'appelle Léopoldine. Je m'appelle Miss Louis. Je m'appelle Mrs. Spencer. Je m'appelle Adèle. Simplement Adèle, c'est mon nom.
Né de père inconnu.
Je suis Adèle, Adèle H.
So let's start with the title. In French, L'Histoire d'Adèle H. The truncation of the name H rather than Hugo draws attention to Adèle's difficult relationship with the name of the famous father. L'Histoire in French means two things. It means history and it means story, an ambiguity that is lost in English where a translator has to choose between the two. Adèle's story, of course, is part of history, as we've just heard. It really happened, as Truffaut emphasised in the opening titles. L'histoire d'Adèle H est authentique. Elle met en scène des événements qui ont eu lieu et des personnages qui ont existé. The story of Adèle H is authentic. It shows events which really happened and people who really existed. He insists on screen at the opening of the film. Which it does, of course, but these events and these people are also crafted into the shape of a narrative and imbued with its creator's own preoccupations and vision of the world. We should begin then with a brief recap of the history, the facts, though without forgetting that nice double meaning of histoire. And here I'm inevitably going to repeat some of the things that Laura has said, but these are the elements I think are important also for the film. So Adèle Hugo was born in 1830, the youngest of Victor and Adèle Hugo's children, though the first, a son, Leopold, had died in infancy. Adèle's older sister, Léopoldine, famously drowned, aged only 19, in a boating accident. She'd recently married, she was pregnant. The voluminous skirts of the period's female fashions undoubtedly dragged her under the water, which in a sense is not irrelevant. And her young husband, in trying to save her, also died. Adele was 13, a very impressionable age. Leopoldine's memory was enshrined in her devastated father's poetry, most famously in Demain des l'Aube. In this one verse, he imagines himself walking towards his daughter's grave. Je marcherai les yeux fixés sur mes pensées. I'll use the translation, perhaps. I don't know how much French is current in Guernsey, but so roughly translated, without quite the beauty of the French, I will walk eyes fixed on my thoughts without seeing anything, not hearing any noise, alone, unknown, stooped, hands crossed, sad, and day for me will be as night. Leopoldine was also commemorated in the relics, including her wedding dress that he and his wife kept and displayed, and the suspension of his writing career by profound grief. Adele already, I think, felt herself to be the less loved of the daughters, born as she was, as her parents' relationship was losing its initial sexual and romantic passion. By the time Adele was born, her mother was already in love with the writer and critic Sainte-Beuve, whereas Leopoldine had been the child of their happiness. In 1852, Louis Napoleon's coup d'etat sent Hugo into exile, first to Brussels, then to Jersey, and in 1855 to Guernsey. Adele was just 21 when the exile began, and she, of course, was also involuntarily exiled. Her journals of the period and the surviving letters of her mother record the father's dominating, if adored, presence, and her own sense of frustration and imprisonment in the family home, far from the Parisian society in which she'd grown up. Adele was beautiful, the photos confirm, and she was an heiress. She received at least 5 proposals of marriage, but her heart had fixed on a somewhat, we think, dissolute Englishman, Albert Pinson. I'm always tempted to say Albert Pinson, but he was English. He was Albert Pinson. Her journals of the early 1850s chronicle family conversations, especially Hugo's lengthy speeches, but given her passion, especially Hugo's lengthy speeches, but also in the secret part of the diary, her passionate feelings for Pinson. At one point, she writes, I need to be a Beatrice, referring to Dante's muse and love, the love of his life, Beatrice. I need to be a Beatrice, or to have a man who will be my Beatrice. Albert Pinson is my Beatrice, she writes. Pinson seems to have proposed at some point but been refused, possibly by Adele's parents refusing consent. The story is now complicated also by finding the marriage license. He joined the British Army as an officer and was sent with his regiment to Halifax, Nova Scotia, because at that time Britain was making preparations to offer support to the Confederate States in the American Civil War. They were there for that reason, though it never actually happened. In 1863, Adele, by now aged 33, escaped and managed to get herself on a ship to Halifax, a remarkable feat for a woman in those days. She then pursued Pinson despite his refusal of marriage or indeed of any further relationship. When he was posted to Barbados in 1866, she followed him there, apparently showing increasing signs of acute mental illness. She was finally brought back to France in 1872, by which time the Second Empire had collapsed and Hugo's exile was over. He was the literary hero and the grand old man of the French Republic, the French Third Republic, while Adele spent the rest of her life in a private asylum, only dying in 1915. But Adele, as we've just seen, wrote. She kept extensive diaries, but wrote the more intimate personal entries in code. In 1969, Francis Verneau-Guy, an American scholar, worked out the code and published the transcribed journals. Truffaut came across these and was drawn to the figure of Adele. He passed them then to his long-term script collaborator, Jean Gruau, who tried out various drafts of a film script before settling with Truffaut on the most unadorned, pared-down version of her story. The film begins with Adele's arrival in Halifax in pursuit of Pinson, contains no flashbacks or contextualizing scenes, focuses only on her obsessive desire to become Pinson's wife. Now, budgetary issues certainly came into this. It costs a lot more to make a film that has lots of scenes shot in Paris at different periods with costumes and armies and so on. And so did, also coming into this decision, was the Hugo family's condition that the great man himself not appear on screen. But largely, I think Truffaut's choice of script was based on aesthetic preferences and on the affinity that Truffaut felt with Adèle's situation. Filming took place, as you know, in Guernsey from January to March 1975. Though the action occurs largely in Halifax, Nova Scotia, Truffaut presumably felt that Guernsey both stood in well for the landscape of Nova Scotia and somehow lent a note of authenticity to a story in which the island's emotional pull played an important part. The Barbados scenes required a further short period of filming in the Ile de Gorée off Dakar. Filming on small islands meant that the crew were isolated from their usual milieu and thrown together in a kind of brief exile with an intensity that's echoed in the film itself. So, why did Truffaut then, by 1975 a celebrated film director, why did he find himself suddenly drawn to what at the time was the little-known story of Victor Hugo's younger daughter? And how did he turn that history into story? Well, there are two main lines of argument that I want to follow. First of all, I want to try to show how Adèle's story resonates with Truffaut's own biography and with themes and motifs that recur throughout his cinema. And secondly, I want to argue that it's especially interesting that this is a woman's story, that it's a human story recounted in the feminine, in the light especially of debates over the sexual politics of Truffaut's cinema. To start off then with why this appeal of the figure of Adèle H for Truffaut. Truffaut's own childhood was not a happy one. He was born to an unmarried mother who seems to have always resented him. He was sent to live with various relatives before his mother, who by now was married, accepted him without much enthusiasm to live with her and his stepfather. Truffaut ran away repeatedly from school, from home, from the army, in which he was briefly enlisted, before finding salvation in the world of cinema. Many of his protagonists, but most notably his fictional alter ego, Antoine Doinel, some of you may have seen Les 400 coups, many then of his protagonists are also marked by a lack of parental love, by what the British psychoanalyst Donald Winnicott termed a lack of holding. So this is also the case, of course, for Adèle, at least in Truffaut's version, but the facts of her biography do provide a solid basis for this sense of affinity. Adèle desperately seeks love and the confirmation of her own identity that being loved could bring. Hers is not really a love story. Who Pinson is, his qualities and his feelings are almost incidental to Adèle's own emotional drama. There is a narrative in that the story progresses from Adèle's arrival at the port of Halifax to her increasingly desperate attempts to have Pinson love her, or at least marry her, to her decline and the eventual return to France recounted in voiceover. But the rhythm and the tone of the film are dominated less by the forward movement of storytelling than by the repetition that characterises obsession, recurring close-ups of her often anguished face. Truffaut described the film at one point as tightly framed, claustrophobic, the story of a face. That's one form of repetition. There are repeated sequences in the bank where she goes to seek letters and money from Guernsey that will enable her to continue her quest. The shot of Adèle's nightmare of drowning superimposed on her restlessly sleeping face is also repeated, recurs several times. Where there are outdoor sequences of a wider world, as you saw, I think, briefly in this trailer, these mainly track Adèle in frenzied, anxious movement, seeking or following Pinson, spying on him. It is quite literally a dark film, Many scenes are shot at night, and otherwise the camera frames the scene in such a way that we almost never see the sky. The shot recurs of Isabelle Adjani's face frontlit but surrounded by darkness. The music of Maurice Jaubert, a composer who died in action in World War II, and therefore over whom lingers a kind of slight sense of tragedy, and his music accompanies 4 of Truffaut's films. So the music of Jaubert is used sparingly, mostly to add a haunting or an anxious accompaniment to scenes of Adèle's unhappiness. There's a recurring motif in Truffaut's films of falling. Protagonists desperate for love fall to the ground in a classic gesture of incapacity to function in the world. You could say of being insufficiently held. Adèle too falls to the ground in the snow outside the bookshop, again in Barbados and in the scene that you're going to see in a minute. Like Catherine in Jules et Jim, again that some of you might possibly have seen, it's another classic of the film world. Like Catherine then, Adèle's vision fails in a bodily manifestation of her disturbed heart and mind, so that in the latter part of the film she wears spectacles. Adèle is one of Truffaut's casualties of love, or rather of lovelessness. The famous scene where Adèle mistakes a passing soldier for Pinson and places her hand on his shoulder, and when he turns round, as you just saw at the end of the trailer, the soldier is Truffaut himself, who in 1975, most people, certainly in France, would have recognised. That scene can be interpreted in many ways, but the two look briefly into each other's eyes, and one interpretation is that this signals a moment of mutual recognition. Still on this point about Adèle and Truffaut, I just want to say something about fathers. Hugo is not just Adèle's parent, but specifically and powerfully he is her father. In the film that first made Truffaut famous, Les 400 coups, the English teacher tries to teach the class to pronounce the question, where is the father? It actually comes out as Wer is the Vater? And it's a question that weaves through his whole film career. Truffaut's heroes are often in search of a father figure. In Freudian terms, of course, the father is the gateway to the public social world, whereas the mother represents the personal, private realm of the domestic and the emotional. But as well as seeking a father, Truffaut's protagonists are often in flight from the crushing power of fathers in the wider sense of patriarchal institutions. Antoine Doinel, in Les 400 coups, and also in the 4 sequels to that film, flees from the school, from the army, and generally from the weight of societal demands and conventions. The overwhelming presence of a famous, powerful father is everywhere in this film, despite the fact that Hugo himself never appears on the screen. Adèle longs to be loved by him, merging her identity with that of the beloved dead daughter, Léopoldine, through her nightmares of drowning and through her substitution of Léopoldine's name for her own. So, yes, at the moment where she gets permission from her father, where she gets a kind of affirmation from her father, she is able to accept her own identity and then gives her true name as opposed to taking on that of Léopoldine. So Adèle is dependent on her father as the continuing bedrock of her life, the sole source of money and of the legal consent that will allow her to marry. But she resists this reduction of her own identity to that of her father's daughter. Truffaut has her refusing to pronounce or acknowledge his name by adopting false identities, by repeating as a sort of yearning incantation, Je suis né de père inconnu, I was born of an unknown father. By finally being driven to admit his name only by writing it on a mirror to be immediately erased. Hugo dominates the film whilst never once appearing. There are recurring shots of his name inscribed in large printed letters on his famous books. His name is spoken several times with reverence. Adèle's life depends on his money and his consent. When Pinson's colonel reads out to him the false marriage announcement, the Hugo parents having believed Adèle's story and placed this, as they really did, in the Guernsey newspaper, The marriage itself, read out loud, the marriage announcement read out loud, takes far fewer words than the long list of Hugo's titles and honours that it ends up with. Truffaut's happier protagonist, like the man himself, finds salvation and an identity through art. Writing in words or writing in images opens the possibility of reshaping experience, of gaining control, of, as we put it in the book, asserting the power of imagination over the fixity of the real. And Adele, too, tries to find herself through writing. There are numerous sequences of her writing compulsively, purchasing ream after ream of paper, the provision of which is the main function of the character of Whistler, the bookseller. Creativity can mean redemption in Truffaut's films, and perhaps we wonder briefly if it could be Adele's. For she takes refuge in committing her life to paper, and at one point physically, viscerally protects her work in the scene in the night hostel, where she sleeps with her arms wrapped around the case that contains her journal, saying, don't touch that, it's my book. And in the case under her bed, she has her journal.
Ne touchez pas à ça. C'est mon livre.
Don't touch it, that's my book. So that the space of redemptive creation is blocked here by the massive presence of the prolific, celebrated writer-father. Adele scribbles away and asks about the fate of the book of music that she'd apparently written at home and that's never been published. Better, she's told, not to draw attention to herself. The father here is everywhere, and there's very little room for the child, for the daughter, to establish any kind of viable identity. But my other line of argument is to do with something slightly different about Adele as a woman in 19th century France. Adele's story resonated with Truffaut then as that of an inadequately loved child in search of an identity and a place in the world, both needing and in flight from the power and authority of a father. But the other aspect is to do with the fact, I think needs consideration, is that Adele is a woman in the profoundly sexually unequal society of the 19th century, the mid-19th century. The sexual politics of Truffaut's cinema and those of the man himself have long been the subject of controversy, and I don't think he would have fared very well if he'd lived long enough to be alive in the age of Me Too. He repeatedly fell for his female stars, and this was the case too with the 19-year-old Isabelle Adjani. He was 42 at the time. She was an up-and-coming star in the theatre, contracted to the prestigious Comédie Française. Truffaut managed to extract her from her contract to star in his film. During the filming, Adjani said some years later in an interview, "I spent my time fending him off as a woman and as an actress." As for Truffaut's films more generally, it's true that the point of view of the screenplay and of the camera itself is predominantly male, and that women are represented as either utterly magical, like Where is the Father? Est-ce que les femmes sont magiques? Are women magic? Is a question that pops up implicitly and explicitly throughout his cinema. And I think we all know by now that putting women on a pedestal is really just another way of denying them full status as human beings. Or alternatively, Truffaut's women are castrating, death-dealing figures like the mother in the foundational Les 400 coups, or like Catherine Deneuve, Jeanne Moreau as the bride who wore black, who literally kills five men. However, like most things in life, if not all, because there are straightforward misogynists out there, but like most things in life, it's a little bit more complicated than that for all sorts of reasons, only one of which is that Truffaut also made films in which the central protagonist, or one of the central protagonists, is a woman, and her story is told, at least in part, empathetically and from her own point of view. Adèle H is the most notable of these, and I think it's a film that quietly registers some of the oppressive reality of being not just the child of the world's most famous author, but his daughter, and that in this way it points critically to a wider social context. For Truffaut, Adèle's problem is one of a lack of any viable identity. Elle se sentait de trop. She felt superfluous. She didn't even have a name of her own. Her first name was her mother's, Adele, and Hugo's name crushed her. Those are words taken from Truffaut himself in conversation with Annette Insdorf. We've seen how the film shows dependence on her father's legal and economic support to be inescapable, the impossibility of financial, legal, or social independence for a woman was written into the organisation of society. Adèle's story epitomises the situation of women in general. And this is also true in the sense that the most available and socially sanctioned means to achieve a form of self-realisation and a recognised place in society was through romance. Adèle's quest for fulfilment takes the form of a search for passionate reciprocal love, or at the very least for the possibility of a new identity, literally a new name, through marriage. She fully adopts the discourse of romance in her letters, her diary writing, and her encounters with Pinson himself, in all of them with a certain theatricality that underlines the fact that she's performing a sanctioned role. Albert, mon amour, she writes, je t'attends, je t'aime, je suis ta femme, nous resterons ensemble jusqu'à la mort. We'll stay together till death. Romantic love in this film is driven by the frustrated desire for identity, for recognition, for a place in the world, rather than by attraction to the specificity of another person. Truffaut said, what I liked this time was the possibility of telling a love story, not with two characters, but with a single character. Pinson is played as a cold, egotistical man, simultaneously conventional and dissolute. His quality is quite irrelevant to Adèle's compulsive desire. Her love for him becomes something akin to a cult, graphically portrayed in the altar that she makes to him, and her desperate offerings of money, of the prostitute she sends to his room like a human sacrifice. In one of the final scenes, his irrelevance to Adèle's emotional drama is underlined by her complete failure to recognise or even see him as she walks the streets of Barbados. Romance here is certainly not the answer. There are moments where a theme of women's collective oppression becomes explicit. Spying on Pinson, Adèle watches both horrified and fascinated as he makes love to another woman. In the following scene, she's seen writing, and we hear her voice pronouncing the words taken from her journal. Je pense à mes sœurs, I think of my sisters who suffer in the brothel and suffer in marriage. In one episode of her pursuit of Pinson, which I think you glimpsed briefly in the trailer, Adèle cross-dresses, assuming male identity, allowing her access to the reception that he's attending, because, of course, like her brothers, to be male means to move freely in the social world. Another such emphatic moment is the repeated shot of Adèle by the sea, affirming the exceptional nature of her exploit in crossing the ocean in pursuit of her dream. C'est quelque chose d'incroyable, she says. We see her against a backdrop, in fact, of the sea in Guernsey and the rocks, and she says it's something incredible that I am about to do, that a woman should walk on the sea, should cross from the old world to the new, and this is, to find her lover, and I will do this. It's a really triumphant kind of moment. So overall, I think the representation of Adèle's plight as both generically human and specifically female informs the whole film. What the film achieves, and this is really my conclusion, what the film achieves is a sort of redemption of Adèle. At the time of its making, a little-known footnote to her father's story. Through the sympathetic telling of that story and through the close attention that the film's aesthetics grant to her. It's noticeable that whereas the opening credits foreground the great man himself as they appear against the background of his magnificently grim and gothic drawings, the closing credits, so the audience's final perception of Adèle, place her centre stage in Guernsey, framed by the wild ocean, speaking her courageous words of challenge to the restrictions on her life. So even if Adele's little tombstone is dwarfed by the pomp and ceremony of her father's national funeral, even if her challenge did founder on the rocks of social and patriarchal law, it's Adjani's beautiful face, now resolute rather than anguished, that closes the film with her brave words, qu'une jeune fille marche sur la mer, passe de l'ancien monde au nouveau monde, and so cette chose-là, je le ferai. Jobert's music here is, if not actually joyful, at least affirmative, and with a note perhaps of exuberance. It seems to me that Truffaut's film offers Adele the care and the loving attention that eluded her in life.